The Psychology of Atheism, Professor Paul C. Vitz.
One of the interesting questions is, of course, with all of our other discussions here, why are there atheists? Why are there people who do not believe in God? And of course, if you mention that to an atheist, he's likely to say, it's obvious. The reasons for God's existence are not convincing. The evidence is not convincing. In fact, they find oftentimes that the evidence is convincing the other way. And this is true. This is true. Some people are atheists because of the evidence and because of the arguments, because of the logic that they find about God to be defective. But I'm a psychologist. And although people can believe things because they're reasonable, I think many people believe things not because they're reasonable, or at least in part they don't believe it because they're reasonable. They believe it because they have psychological reasons for believing it. Now, one of the oldest criticisms of people who believe in God, a criticism that was first developed by atheists actually, is that they believe in God because it's psychologically satisfying for the believer. We believe in God because it's a nice and comforting thing. Now, this is called the ad hominem argument. In other words, you're arguing that something isn't true because of what it means to the person who has the belief. But what I would like to discuss today is evidence that atheists also have reasons for disbelieving in God, and that there are psychological reasons that underlie many an atheist's position. And so what I'm proposing is that psychology as an argument cuts both ways, even though historically it's usually been used as an argument against believers. Now, I got interested in this question for two reasons. One, I'm a former atheist, and so I had time after I became a believer to reflect on my background and on the background of many atheists that I knew. Now, this does not mean I'm a terrible critic of atheists or a basher or anything like that. I don't want to bash myself. After all, I was an atheist for 20 years. And many of my friends are atheists, and I have great respect for them. So this is not an issue of attacking or not attacking. I'm challenging both the believer and the unbeliever to think about some of the psychological reasons, some of the unconscious reasons that predispose somebody to being an atheist. In addition, I had another reason for being interested in this, and that was that I began, just for other interest, to read some of the biographical material about atheists. I began to read about their lives. And as I did, I picked up a particular theme that I wondered about, and eventually it was all clarified and precipitated when, of all things, I read a statement by Sigmund Freud. And here's what Freud said. I'm paraphrasing, but I think I'm pretty accurate here. Freud said, "Nothing is more familiar than to find a young person stop believing in God as soon as he loses respect for his earthly father." In other words, it's hard to believe in God if your own father is unworthy of respect or is in some important way defective. Freud never followed this up. Freud was publicly, certainly, an atheist. I decided to follow it up. In particular, I came up with a hypothesis that's a little more general than Freud's, and it can be called the defective father hypothesis. In other words, that a father, if he's defective, sets up a strong pressure, not a totally determining one, but a strong pressure toward atheism on the part of his children. Particularly, I would think, young, intelligent, sort of intellectually oriented boys, for whom their father is such a symbol of many things that are positive, or if he's a bad father, of many things which are negative. And as I read the literature, I thought about the ways in which a father can lose his son's respect. And I came up with 3 of them, 3 objective criteria for a defective father. One of them is a father can be defective because he rejects and abandons his family. A father can be defective because he's abusive, stays in the family, doesn't reject them, but he's abusive and critical and hostile, a tyrant at home. A father can be defective because he dies. A dead father is a non-existent father and a defective one in the eyes of many children. For example, a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, even a 6 or 8-year-old can see a father who dies as someone who has abandoned them, as someone who has left. Many children, particularly young children, don't understand death as an accident. They think it was somehow or other a rejection of them. In any case, a dead father is not present in most cases unless there's a substitute father. And so the third kind of defective father is the dead father. So here they are. The rejecting and abandoning father, the abusive father, and the dead father. Any one of those makes for what I called a defective father. And the argument psychologically is the following. If your father is defective, it makes it very hard to believe in God. And Freud proposed that because Freud himself saw that our earthly father is somehow or other a kind of psychological model of our understanding of who God is. And so if our psychological model of God, based on our own experience, is defective, disturbing, disappointing, unworthy of respect, then it sets up a strong precondition for the child, when he becomes older, to become an atheist. At least that's my hypothesis. And it's very testable. We can look at evidence. So let's look at some of the evidence. And here's what I did. I looked at the childhood of many of the famous atheists in history. These are almost all philosophers or political thinkers. Almost all of them are well known because I'm only interested in what I would call strong atheists or intense atheists. People for whom atheism was an important part of their life. There are lots of what I would call mild atheists, or rather soft atheists. These are people who are atheists but not preoccupied with it. It's not a big thing for them in a psychological sense. So we're not talking about them. We're talking about the intense or strong unbeliever. And I made up a list of these famous thinkers and atheists, and then I made up a list of other historical figures who were in the same cultures at the same time, roughly, but who were believers, who were famous theists, people who often argued with these atheists, or at least were publicly arguing the pro-belief position. And if you will, the control group consists of the theists, and the experimental group consists of the atheists. And the question is there evidence in the childhood of these two groups that distinguishes the atheists from the theists? So that's what I looked at. And so I'd like to summarize some of that evidence for you. It's really very interesting because although this is a general thesis, everybody's own life is different. Every case history is curiously different and varied. And there's nothing more interesting sometimes, I think, than the childhood and early life of people who later became famous. So here are some of the people I looked at, and these are all thinkers, philosophers, and other intellectuals that are important in the history of the Western world, where atheism first emerged as as an official or standard position. And so I'll just mention some of those who, in my judgment, fit the thesis, and then we'll talk about, or give you the list anyway, of those who don't, who are in the control group, and then we'll give some specific examples of what it was like in the childhood of some of these people. Here are people who had clearly defective fathers and are famous atheists. Perhaps the most famous of all is Friedrich Nietzsche, who announced to the world that God is dead. His father died when he was 4 years old after 2 years of his father's ill health. Nietzsche himself says it was the most disturbing and dramatic day of his life when he woke up to discover that his father was dead when he was 4-something. But other famous atheists with bad fathers included Freud himself, Jean-Paul Sartre. Others would be Feuerbach, Ludwig Feuerbach, Voltaire. I'm not quite sure we want to call him an atheist. He was sort of an abstract deist, but he was certainly belongs in this group of thinkers. Others would include Hobbes, Hume, many of the others. Let me go on to some of the theists now and mention some of their names in advance. We have Pascal, Edmund Burke, William Wilberforce, G.K. Chesterton, Moses Mendelssohn, lots of others in that list. But that's the kind of intellectual we're going to be looking at. So let's get down to some of the lives of these people. I'm going to begin with someone that many people don't know about. His name is Ludwig Feuerbach. He was a German philosopher, wrote his major works in the 1840s. He's the first philosopher and first Western thinker, I believe, to suggest that the belief in God is a projection of our psychological needs. So he was an atheist, and he proposed the idea that God was a function of our own needs long before Sigmund Freud. But what about Ludwig's life? Here are some funny things about it. Very distinctive. Ludwig Feuerbach's father was a famous legal thinker or jurist of the time, so he was a well-known person in his society. This is around 1810 or so in Germany, in a moderately small town. His father was married. Ludwig was, at the time this all happened, about 12, 13. What happened was this. The elder Feuerbach, also a professor, abandoned the family, went and lived with the wife and his best friend, the wife of his best friend, in another town. There he took up, if you will, as the lover of the wife of his best friend. I didn't find anything about the best friend. I guess he seemed to not care that his wife was now living with Professor Feuerbach. But obviously this meant a public abandonment of his family. The senior Feuerbach lived there with this other woman for about 5 or 6 years until young Ludwig was perhaps 18, about ready to go to college. At that time, this woman died. Oh, I forgot to mention, the senior Feuerbach had a child by this woman, and he named the child after himself. Well, when the woman died, Ludwig's father, and presumably the child, came back to live with his original wife and with the family. Certainly Ludwig's mother must have been very tolerant or forgiving. In addition to Feuerbach's father being, if we will, a philanderer, an open rejecter of his family, he was known for his intense and explosive temper. He was called Vesuvius for short. He got in lots of fights and arguments with other professors at the university. So here we have a very classic example of a defective father. He abandons, rejects the family, later comes back, and is famous in his personal life for being a volcano that could explode at any time. Let's look at some others. Take Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is sometimes called the great pessimist. Again, we're in the German culture in the mid-1800s. Schopenhauer was the only child of a well-to-do family. His father was a merchant or in the commercial world, and his mother was something of a social person. In fact, his mother rejected young Arthur, told him that she felt her life had been ruined by him. So he had a terrible relationship with his mother. All his life, Arthur couldn't stand his mother. But it gets more interesting. Arthur had something of a distant relationship with his father, and of course a negative one with his mother, and really a distant relationship with both of them for most of the time, because Arthur was left with nannies, and his well-to-do parents traveled around Europe, London and other places like that, often leaving Arthur with somebody to take care of him. Leaving your child with a nanny or with another person, it's not just characteristic of today. It was very common in the well-to-do families of a couple of centuries ago. There was a period, however, of a few years when Arthur was around 8 or 10 years old where the family stayed put for a while, and Arthur had a positive relationship with his father for that time. He continued with a negative one with his mother. A few years later, after being separated, when Arthur was 16, the father came back, and his son went into business with his father. And he had been working in his father's business for a short time. As I said, Arthur was 16 then, when his father committed suicide. He jumped out of a third-story window of a building and was killed by the fall. Young Arthur thought that the whole cause of it was probably his mother. This is speculative. But it was shortly after that that Arthur said that he became very depressed about the world, and it was clear to him that he had no confidence that God existed. I know 2 other cases of this, not of famous atheists, but of friends, people that I know, where when a father committed suicide, in both cases it happened when the child, one a boy and one a girl, were 16. And within a year or 2 they had lost their faith. In both cases their father had been associated with religion. In one instance the father was a minister, and the other the father was the person who always went to church with his daughter. But when they committed suicide, it was such a rejection of the child. And that's one of the things I think that people don't understand about suicide, or at least many people don't. They can understand that the person who commits suicide is depressed, but I don't think they understand how the others around them feel it as a terrible rejection. And it means that everything they stand for is painful to the memory of the people who survive, and they often reject everything that person stood for. Some other examples. How about Freud himself? Freud's father didn't die, but Freud's father was one that he had great trouble respecting. All Freud's biographers agree that Freud's father, Yakov, was weak in confronting anti-Semitism. And Sigmund Freud, although he was a complicated man and in many ways sort of was ambivalent on many subjects, he was a courageous intellectual, a courageous man, and he respected courage in other people. And he himself stood up against anti-Semitism, both physically and intellectually. But he had a discussion with his father when he was 12 years old, and his father told him that an anti-Semite, some youth, had knocked his hat off there in Vienna. And Sigmund asked his father what he did when that happened, and his father said, "Oh, I just walked over, picked it up, and walked away." Freud's biographical material contains this event. All of his biographers agree that it was one of the reasons why Freud had great difficulty respecting his father. There are many other reasons why Freud didn't respect his father. But one of them has come to light recently in the letters that Freud wrote to one of his colleagues during the 1890s. He mentions in those letters that his father was a pervert, and that the effects of this were observable in the lives of his younger siblings, particularly his sisters. Now, we don't know what that meant. We don't know exactly what kind of perversion his father was being charged with, but we know that Freud said that in two of his letters, and that whatever it was, it's another good reason for why he lost respect for his father. Also for Freud, his father was associated with religion. In his latter years, Freud's father, Yakov, studied the Jewish religion, studied the Talmud and other things of that kind. And in addition, his father was never gainfully employed while they lived in Vienna in any obvious occupation or job. He didn't have status in his father's community as being, let's say, a successful businessman or a professional man or anything of that kind. It's not clear what he did when he was living in Vienna all the years that Freud was growing up there. And finally, Freud was always rather bitter and critical of his father and his family for not having much money. So the combination meant that Freud's own comment about losing respect for your own father certainly was something that happened to him. How about a few other examples? Here are just a few of them. Take Voltaire. Voltaire, as I said, he's probably a deist, an abstract kind of theist, so he's not the best pure atheist, but he was pretty close to it and often argued against the church and the Christian concept of God. Well, Voltaire very much disliked his father. One sign of that was he took the name Voltaire. He rejected his father's name and the name he had known all his childhood and youth, and made up a name, Voltaire. Everyone knows him by that name. No one is quite sure where it came from. But rejecting your father's name is one example of rejecting your father because you find him unacceptable. In Voltaire's extensive correspondence, he mentions his father a number of times, always negatively, always in a critical sense. So we're not quite sure what the basis for the critique of his father was, but we know that Voltaire rejected him. It's even interesting that the first play that young Voltaire ever wrote, at least the first play that was ever produced when Voltaire was about 25 or 26, was called Oedipus. And it's a takeoff of the famous Greek Oedipus Rex, where there are thinly disguised references to killing God and killing the king, probably the two most important father figures at the time, certainly in France, of the 1700s. Another famous, almost certain atheist is Hobbes. Hobbes was really publicly more of a materialist. It was dangerous during his life. We're going back pretty far now into the 1600s. It was dangerous to be an atheist then. But Hobbes was almost certainly that because he was a materialist and believed only that matter was the entire nature of what existed. He was also very anti-clerical, opposed to the church in many ways. So what about young Hobbes? Well, young Hobbes, when he was, 2 or 3 years old, something like that, here's what happened. His father was an Anglican clergyman. Not a very successful one, because in the village that he grew up in, Hobbes' father was known to fall asleep in his own services. I don't suppose he fell asleep in his own sermons, but at least he fell asleep in his own services. So he was something of a mediocre or unacceptable clergyman at that. But when Hobbes was young, this father of his got in a fight with another clergyman out in front of the church. Apparently it was a real fight, knock-down, drag-out fight. And his father knocked this other man down, seems to have hurt him some, and then fled. In other words, his father fled from the family, abandoned the family, and was never heard from again. He just took off and never came back. There were rumors that his father settled on the other side of London in some small community, but as far as we know from the biographical material, there was never any further contact between Hobbes' father and his family, much less young Hobbes. So Hobbes was educated by an uncle who paid for the schooling, not a man that apparently Hobbes had much of a relationship with. It doesn't look like Hobbes had any substitute father, no uncle came in, no other person. So Hobbes' attitude of hostility to the church and to the clerics of his time is not far to look for. There are many others. But I think you've got the picture, at least with many of the famous atheists. There are many more. Nietzsche had a big problem with his father. I mentioned that before. His father died when he was 4, and he never had a substitute father. It's clear that Nietzsche missed having a father. He was raised by the female members of his family for the rest of his life until he became a young man. Nietzsche was very insecure about his manhood. He created, if you will, a Superman, das Übermensch, as the ideal father, the ideal man that he could identify with. He wanted a religion that was based on Dionysius, the life principle. He saw his father as connected to the death principle, if you will. His father was sickly and died. His father was also a minister, and young Nietzsche had been close to him. Even as young as 2 years of age, young Nietzsche had gone and sat in his father's study and talked to him while he worked on his sermons. So he was close to his father, loved him as a little boy can, and then found his father dead when he was about 4.5, a day that he remembers in his own autobiographical material. Nietzsche himself said that atheism, his atheism, wasn't something that was the result of thought. It wasn't a rational position. He said, I knew I was an atheist by instinct. From a psychologist's point of view, this means that Nietzsche knew that there was no God because his unconscious told him so. He knew it not because he was thinking about it, but because he felt it. Nietzsche missed his father all his life, and there are many comments about it in his latter years when he was a well-known philosopher. In summary, I would say that when Nietzsche said God is dead, he was psychologically saying Dad is dead. Dad has abandoned me. Dad was weak. Dad represents the Christian God who was weak and who died. I want a Dionysian God who is filled with life and who is strong. I want a Superman. Still others. Here I'm going to move not to famous atheists, but to some contemporary people. Many of you have heard of Madalyn Murray O'Hair, a famous American atheist, not because she was a philosopher or an intellectual, but because she was head of the American Atheist Society and because she was instrumental in removing prayer from the public schools. Well, we know a little bit about Madalyn from the biographical material of one of her sons. And in describing their family life, this boy says that one of the events that he remembers when he was growing up is when Madalyn threatened to kill her father with a 10-inch butcher knife. And she said to her father, "I'll kill you yet. I'll dance on your grave." Fortunately, that never happened. But we do know that Madalyn hated her father intensely. We don't know why. but she probably had good reason. Daughters don't hate their fathers and want to kill them without being given cause, and often very, tragic and painful cause. There are other examples, too, of contemporary atheists that I could mention, but I think you've got the picture. So what I want to do now briefly is look at some of the theists of that time. And here, it's not so interesting because tragedy and anger and bitterness and disappointment, when they happen in our childhood, are much more interesting than descriptions of positive, relatively peaceful and supportive family life. But that's what I found. I started with Pascal, a famous believer in the 1600s in France, famous mathematician and logician. He was basically homeschooled by his father, who was a judge. He and his sister were brought up and educated at home. And a very strong bond developed between Blaise Pascal and his father. In his own notes, Pascal refers to his father very positively, very favorably. There's no doubt that he was deeply impressed by him. All of his education had been supported by his father, who spent enormous amounts of time with both Pascal and his sister. Pascal was something of a mathematical genius. His father had decided he didn't want Pascal at age 11 to read Euclid because he thought he was too young for it. So Pascal discovered all the major theorems of Euclid by using a stick and drawing the diagrams in the sand. He discovered the theorems himself. Other examples are Edmund Burke. Now, Burke had a moderately positive relationship with his actual father. Sometimes it was ambivalent. But more importantly, he had a substitute father. He had another man, an uncle, that he spent a great deal of time with, whom he said was the most impressive man he had ever met. And he long revered him. He also had very many good friends in his life whose fathers sometimes served as substitute fathers. He had a schoolmaster who was especially much of a father figure for him. So Burke had positive relationships with his father. So did John Henry Newman, famous for becoming later Cardinal Newman. An interesting character here now is William Wilberforce. Wilberforce, a famous theist and believer in his lifetime, is famous as an English legislator in Parliament for making England the first country to outlaw the slave trade. When Wilberforce was 9 years old, his father died. Prior to that, it seemed to have been a positive relationship. That could have set up something negative, but it didn't, because the mother sent the boy to live with an uncle and aunt. The uncle and aunt were very religious. They were early Methodists. They were called enthusiasts at the time. And there they had a religious home. Young William Wilberforce said he treated these people as his own mother and father, and when he was forced to leave a few years later, he felt like he was losing his parents. Also relevant is at that home, he met a man by the name of John Newton. I don't know if you know who John Newton is. Interesting character. He was a former sea captain and a slave captain who had converted, become an evangelical Christian, and who first introduced young Wilberforce to the problem of slavery. Most people know Newton because he's a well-known songwriter. He's the author of Amazing Grace, a song that most people are familiar with. But it was years later when Newton, about age 21, young for a man at that time, went to Parliament and began his campaign to get rid of slavery. And all of this was done in the context of his evangelical Protestant faith. Thomas Reid, another famous philosopher about this time in the 1700s in Scotland, had a positive relationship with his father. So did Joseph Butler, William Paley. We'll go on from them. We'll go to G.K. Chesterton. He had a very good relationship with his father. One of the reasons was his father stayed home all the time and, in a way, educated and entertained his children. One reason was his father didn't like his business. He was in real estate and he didn't like it, so he would stay home all the time. He had a great time with his kids, and G.K. Chesterton is famous for saying, I had a happy childhood and I'm sorry to disappoint all the people who were looking for the other. Another example of a good father is Moses Mendelssohn. Now we go back to Germany in the late 1700s. Moses Mendelssohn took the name Mendelssohn, son of Mendel. That was his father. Besides his father, with whom he had a good relationship, he also had a strong relationship with other rabbis. These rabbis were father figures who supported him. And Mendelssohn was a famous theist at the time. The same thing is true of Martin Buber. He had a strong relationship with his father and also his grandfather, who was often his functional father, and then his father, even though his mother abandoned him at the age of 3. So it's not a Protestant thing, it's not a Catholic thing, it's not a Jewish thing. It seems to be the case, whether your background is in any one of these traditions, that somehow or other a good father strengthens the possibility that you can believe in God. I think I'd like now to talk a little bit about two important atheists that in certain ways don't fit. To suggest a hypothesis like this, we have to keep in mind that if it works or is more or less true for a significant proportion of people, that's a good psychological hypothesis. But that it's true for all intense atheists, no. People are too complicated, too varied. As one example of this, let's take Karl Marx. He's famous as an atheist. When he first read Feuerbach, he was delighted. It was one of the major influences on him in the 1840s. Karl Marx's father, what about him? His father was a bourgeois, successful businessman. His father was German and Jewish. His father actually came from a long line of famous rabbis, but he converted to Christianity, not for any religious reason, not because he had any intellectual or emotional attraction to Christianity, but because it was socially convenient and useful. So perhaps Marx didn't respect his father for that. But I could find no good evidence of that. Meanwhile, Karl Marx went to college, and his father paid for all of his college, and after college he had plenty of extra money. So his father supported him. And there's no evidence that young Karl had any deep, intense falling out with his father. So as it stands, I would say this: there's no good interpersonal evidence of trauma or anger with the father in the case of Karl Marx. And so the hypothesis doesn't seem to work there. But there's one nagging part of Marx's life that makes me wonder if there might be something there of which we have no record. And that's this. Karl Marx spent his entire life as a thinker and theoretician attacking the bourgeois capitalist class and saying that they were basically the class from hell and that had to be destroyed. That's the whole meaning of communism, or at least a good part of it. The one thing he hated then was the class, the social class and the economic class that his father came from and represented. The father who'd given him all his money for college and given him his spending money, and about which we have no evidence that he was critical of his son. So maybe there was something going on there, either in the terms of lack of respect or in terms of some trauma or nasty relationship. I don't know. Maybe it's just an exception. I want to mention what I think is a real exception, though, and that is a famous atheist from the 18th century in France, and that's Denis Diderot. I could find no negative relationship between young Diderot and his father. There was a negative relationship when Diderot was in his 20s, but I think that was too late and too superficial. They had an argument over Diderot's wife. Diderot married a woman that his father thought was inappropriate, and it turned out his father was right. But although they had an argument over that, I think it was too little and too late to represent a real basis for disliking his father, and there's not other evidence that he really disliked his father earlier. So I think Diderot is inexplicable from the point of view of this hypothesis. Before concluding, I'd like to mention a little bit about the differences between men and women when it comes to atheism. You may have obviously noted that with the exception of Madeleine Murray O'Hair, all the atheists I've talked about have been men. Now, partly this is just because of the intellectual history of the West, but there's something else going on. I did come across some women atheists, but most women atheists were not what I would call true atheists. And so I'd like to suggest a difference, not always correct, but roughly on average, between men and women. When men reject God, I would propose they usually substitute another abstract system or another system of belief. It may be a philosophy of materialism or rationalism. It may be communism. It may be science. They will propose another worldview of an intellectual and commonly abstract kind to replace God and religion. I think some recent scientists have said that one of the reasons they are very in favor and very strongly support Darwin is it allowed them, as has been said, to be intellectually fulfilled atheists. But when I find women who reject God, it's not always. Remember, you can always, men and women are different in height, but not always. There are a lot of tall women and short men. So it's not always the case. But in general, women see God as someone with whom, in a sense, they have a personal relationship. And often what happens is when they reject God, they take another personal relationship as a substitute. Now, one example of this is many feminists aren't atheists exactly because they now believe in a goddess. So they have a relationship with the goddess or with perhaps with sisterhood and all the other feminists and so forth. But you'll notice that that's an interpersonal worldview rather than necessarily an abstract and intellectual one. One interesting example of this is the famous female atheist, Simone de Beauvoir, a French thinker and a close associate, personal associate, if you will, of the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. And young Simone grew up in a very devout Catholic family, and for a while she thought of perhaps going into a convent, and she spoke of Jesus as important in her life. Unfortunately, her mother was one of those very controlling mothers who was very hovering, stayed over young Simone and watched what she did, even went to her classes to make sure she was being given the right instruction for many years, until Simone was 16 or perhaps later. Her mother opened her mail. I mean, talk about control. And so when Simone went to college, went to Paris at 18 and ran into and met and became a friend and then an associate and lover of Jean-Paul Sartre, all of this meant freedom to her, escape from this closed system. And in her own biographical material, she describes this change as, I substituted Jean-Paul for God. In other words, a new personal relationship had replaced a relationship to God or perhaps to Jesus. So it was a personal exchange and not exactly the common kind of atheist that we normally think of. Functionally, of course, she was an atheist. Well, those are some of my comments about some of the differences between men and women. There's a lot more to be explored here and many more cases, I suppose, to investigate. In closing, I want to say a few things about something I alluded to briefly in the case of Edmund Burke. And that was he had a substitute father in an uncle that he met and lived with and truly respected. There are other cases of that, of substitute fathers. Unfortunately, Nietzsche didn't get one. Bertrand Russell never got one. Neither did Jean-Paul Sartre. But one interesting example is Walker Percy, a novelist. Everything was set up, you might say, the wrong way. His grandfather committed suicide when Walker Percy was 1 year of age. When he was 10, his father started being depressed, hospitalized, and shortly thereafter, his father committed suicide with a shotgun in the attic. So his grandfather is dead from suicide, probably. His father is clearly dead from suicide. He's now living with his mother and Uncle Will, a cousin who they called Uncle Will. And then his mother drives the car off a bridge and dies, and people think it was probably a suicide. The only thing he's got left as a substitute parent is Uncle Will. And young Walker is taken over by that uncle and his two younger brothers as well. And Uncle Will devoted his life to being a father for those three young boys. He taught them literature and poetry, introduced them to the classics, educated them with a grand and tragic view of life. When Walker was in his 20s, middle to late 20s, his Uncle Will died. And it was as though his father had died, and he said he agreed that his uncle had never, as far as he had observed, done a selfish thing in his life. He had devoted his life to these three boys. And so it gave a very positive understanding of what it is to be a father to young Walker Percy, who later became a Christian, a Catholic, and a rather well-known writer in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So substitute fathers can come in there, and they're very important, but not everybody gets them. Now, I'm not saying, as I said with the exceptions, that everybody, that all the intense atheists are going to follow this pattern. I'm sure there are exceptions. There's an awful lot of freedom in a person's choice on this. What attitude will they take to a father who was defective, abandoning, rejecting? One of the common patterns that I've observed are ministers' sons who end up becoming atheists or skeptics. Why? Because many times the minister shows more attention to his congregation, to his parishioners, than he does to his own family. He sort of abandons his family while he serves as a shepherd for other people. Their sons sense this and get angry and rejecting. And they have good reason to be angry and to be rejecting. Ministers are often neglectful of their families, and sometimes you have religious figures who are even hostile and critical of their children. And I think that creates the worst example. Standing for God and being an SOB, so to speak. We have to understand the psychology that is set in motion here. It isn't determinative, but it certainly sets up a pressure. And I think I can close with one little anecdote. I hope this doesn't date me too much, but there was a well-known writer and columnist for the New York Times named Russell Baker. That's back a decade or so ago. And Russell published his autobiography, and in it he talks about his own early life. And one of the events that he talks about with some detail and poignancy occurred when young Russell was 5 years old. His father had a heart attack and went to the hospital, and there he died. And Russell was very hurt by this, very upset and angry about it. And he was talking with the family, I guess you'd say babysitter, nanny. I think her name was Bessie. And he said to Bessie, "Why did God allow this?" And Bessie says, "I don't know, but we do know God is a loving God." And young Russell said, "Well, if God's a loving God, then why did he let my father die?" Well, Bessie had no answer for that, really, except to say that in her judgment, the boy's father was alive up in heaven and happy. But Russell then wrote in his autobiography, "I think at age 5, I kind of gave up on God. I became, if you will, a skeptic. At any rate, I was convinced that God was a lot less interested in people who lived in our town or on this globe than everybody else thought." At the age of 5, he said, "I became a skeptic." I think that sort of summarizes some of the poignancy that a child can have in their reaction to the defective father, a dying father, a dead one, an abusive one, a critical one, a hostile one, an abandoning one. Those are all ways in which it can happen. And so I'm trying to suggest that it's not just theists who can sometimes have psychological reasons for believing in God. Atheists can often have psychological reasons for disbelieving in God. And I think that means when we as atheists and theists get together, we should understand, therefore, the complexity of some of the background that each person brings to the situation. And I think then that maybe as we move past the 20th century, past the century of psychology, we might let go of the ad hominem arguments. People don't believe in God because, let's say, they believe in pie in the sky, and people don't reject God because he's too much like their father who rejected them. These are relevant, but the real issue has to be to talk not about the ad hominem issues, but to talk about the evidence and the logic and all of the things that the life of the mind, freed from some of our unconscious pressures, might allow us to understand. Thank you.